If I needed to set boundaries at work today, I'm going to tell you exactly what I would do. If you clicked on this episode, you're probably at a point where you feel like your back is up against the wall. There's just this growing resentment, frustration. There just needs to be a better way. Boundaries have been such a journey for me, like to the point where, I've been in these situations where I feel like my back is up against the wall. And, I think back to when I used to live in Chicago and at the beginning of my career, I was saying yes to a bunch of things in the workplace. And every single day I felt like my back was up against the wall. And I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know if there was an option to say no. And that put me in a really, really difficult place from a health perspective. And I started getting all these food sensitivities. I was having anxiety attacks every day at work, multiple times throughout the day. Like, it was just taking a toll on my body. And I've been working a lot on boundary setting since then because, literally my health is on the line. And I would imagine if you're here watching this, your health is probably on the line as well, whether it's your mental health, your physical health, your spiritual health. Like, I think what's so challenging about being in these situations at work where we feel like our backs are up against the wall is that we feel like we have to say yes to everything because that's the only way to get ourselves off of the wall or like get ourselves out of being pinned up against a wall. I feel like over the past few years, I've really done a lot of work to like disassemble any sort of thinking around the fact that like, oh, when my back is up against the wall, I can only say yes. This week, it was like, all those sorts of beliefs were just like shattered. And it felt like I was seeing the inside of a clock in that every belief or myth or limiting belief or anything I thought about setting boundaries in the workplace was like totally debunked. It was totally shattered. Where my mind is going with this is like, holy shit, like all of us, there's so many of us who have had this very rigid view of like whether or not we can set boundaries in the workplace. And in workplaces where, or in situations where your back is up against the wall, so many people feel like they can only say yes to things. And if I've learned anything this week, it's that is not true. I think so many people have this question of, how do I know when I need boundaries? And what I found in trying to answer that question is like, when trying to figure out how do you know if you need boundaries and where do you need boundaries, I think you have to look at the situations and the tasks and the people and the things that are making you so frustrated and throwing you off balance so much to the point where it's frustration, it's resentment, it's anger, it's disassociation, it's you going and eating whatever numbing. Is it chocolate? Is it chips? Is it fast food? Is it, smoking? Is it alcohol? Like, what is making you go to these numbing behaviors? And I think once you identify kind of the thing that triggers those feelings or those behaviors, I think you then have to look further upstream and determine like, okay, I need to set the boundary here so that I then don't go into these behaviors or these patterns or these feelings at the end of the day that's just your body telling you that something is off and we need to course correct. So I think those are the feelings and behaviors that come up when boundaries don't exist. and they can help you identify where boundaries need to exist. But I think there's this other element of recognizing the environment you're in and the certain dynamics that exist within that environment and how can you move throughout them. So when I think about setting boundaries at work, it's me setting boundaries with other people. It's other people setting boundaries with me. And then it's also, and this is what I was learning this week, it's also me telling people that they can set boundaries with me, which that was like a totally new thing. So let me start at the beginning. I'll start with the first one of like me setting boundaries with other people in the workplace. Now, I'll say at the beginning of last year, I had been a person who had said yes to everything, and my back was constantly up against the wall. And, I was working super long hours. I was taking on a workload that was far too much for myself, for one person. And, it was this constant state of people coming to me every second of the day. Everyone needs something. Everyone needs me to do this or do that or say this or say that or show up here or show up there. It was so much. And, I had a point last year of just like, I just need to say no. Like I've said yes for so long. We're saying no. And at that point, I was at this boiling point of just frustration and resentment. And I was almost at a point, I was at a point where I just didn't care anymore. I didn't care about how I was perceived at work. And it was also right on the tipping point of me just not caring about anything in my life anymore. And that is literally me. Like I had to sit myself down and say to myself, like, I have to say no, because I cannot get myself to a point where I'm sacrificing things in my life, in my personal life, because of the stuff that's happening at work. Like that just cannot happen. That's happened to me before. It almost destroyed me, and it can't happen again. And so I was at that point last year of just like, I need to say no. So how did I say no? I started with somebody who I trusted, a peer that I really trust in the workplace. And I went to them and, I was so in a state of apathy at the time that like I just didn't even care what I looked like when I was showing up at work. Like I was not trying to hide anything. Like you could see it all over my face that something was wrong. And so I think where I started was confiding in a peer that I really trusted and somebody who was in a similar situation as me. They knew every dynamic that was happening around me. The first step I took was being vulnerable with that person to say, hey, this is what I'm feeling. This is how I'm interpreting this environment. This is how it's impacting me. Like it's now impacting my life and how I feel about myself in my life. And this has to change. And I think what was so helpful in that was like going to somebody who not only I trust, but somebody who I know wants the best for me. And they could also help me navigate to the next step. So by me, and that was also almost like a practice run with them of just even stating the fact that this was too much. Through that conversation, I was able to get, almost like brainstorm and bounce off ideas of like how to bring this up to my boss. And, in that, I got all the inspiration to then go have a conversation with my boss. And, I think I'm so grateful for the manager I have. And, you know, this is somebody who is first and foremost cares about you as a human and your mental health. And she knew I was like, she could see that I was struggling. I mean, I couldn't hide my facial expressions. I couldn't hide like my vibe. I was like oozing this like overwhelm. And so I went to her and I was just, again, I took the vulnerable approach and I was just like, look, I can't do this. And in the most like, I just shared as much as I possibly could about how I struggle with burnout. I've always struggled with burnout, and it just stems from, you know, working in environments where I feel like my back is up against the wall and I haven't had boundaries in previous work environments. And now I need to have boundaries, you know? And yeah, it was just a really honest conversation of like, look, this is realistically what I can handle. This is what I can't handle. I'm currently in a space where I'm teetering on the edge of burnout, and I need to pull myself back away from that edge. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to kind of do a hard course correct here. And what that looks like is like reconfiguring how my days look. It's like logging on later. It's logging off a little bit earlier so I can go to a yoga class or a workout class or go on a walk, or, you know, it's taking an hour lunch break. It's giving myself the time and the space to not think about anything so that I could start to bring myself back to life, because I could feel myself falling back into this space of just like not caring. You know, I think when I had that conversation with my manager, she was so receptive to that. And even when I brought up to her, like, this workload is way too much, you know, we immediately started to reprioritize. She called an emergency meeting and we like hard ranked the top 3 to 5 things that needed to be focused on. And it's like, I'm only focusing on priority 1. Once that's done, I'll go on to priority 2. Once that's done, I'll go on to priority 3, and so on. And so I think that sort of thing was super helpful. And, you know, I've been finding myself in a similar situation lately where, you know, it's tricky, right? Because in the workplace, you're operating in an environment, really, no matter what workplace you're in, you're operating in a space where some people have boundaries, some people don't have boundaries. Some people are going to try and push you to the limit to get whatever they need out of you. Like, at the end of the day, we have to take care of ourselves. And if we aren't taking care of ourselves, then no one else is. And if we aren't advocating for ourselves, and if we aren't drawing the line in the sand to say no, people are just going to walk all over us, and they're going to keep you pinned up with your back against the wall, and they're going to keep pushing you. And I think, you know, people, you know, even if you've set boundaries, like what I've been finding is, particularly in the past couple weeks, is like, even though you set those boundaries, like, for example, for me, I hardcore set boundaries like a year ago, but everything shifts and changes, and you know, people are so focused on going about their own lives that they may forget about the boundaries that you have. So you have to constantly be reminding people of those boundaries and stepping into those boundaries with conviction. And what I think is fascinating about that is, like, we seem to have to get to a point of being so fed up, being so pissed off, being so frustrated, being so angry, being so like something is wrong, to the point where we start to fight. And we start to step into what we need with conviction, with defiance, with this I don't give a fuck about what anyone else thinks. I'm doing this for me, and I'm doing this because I need to do this in order to, feel good in my life. And, I think that's a super interesting thing of like, if only we could just always step into and operate and move into these sort of boundaries with conviction and state the boundary and set the boundary and not waver. And I think that's a huge thing that I have to work on and am constantly working on in my own life of like, when you're trying to move forward in your life, if you're trying to move on to the next chapter or operate differently or approach a situation from a new angle, you're always going to be tested on what you've done in the past. And for me, my Achilles heel is these freaking boundaries around work. And, I think it's likely the same for a lot of people too. It's just the Achilles heel boundary that is getting pressed upon is just going to be different for all of us. But there's definitely, those hot buttons for everyone. I've found when setting boundaries for myself with a manager or with a peer even, I've found so much success in going with the vulnerable approach, because in that you are building trust with somebody else. You're bringing them into your life and you're understanding each other better so that they can, start to shield you from other things in the future. So like a year ago when I set those boundaries, that's still paying off for me today in the sense of there's people around me who are shielding me from different things that I don't even know about, but I do know that they're shielding me from them, which is incredible. And that's the result of setting boundaries. Also, there's always going to be a need to continuously set boundaries, and when I think about that for myself and in the workplace I'm in, there's a lot of change always happening and dynamics are shifting, teams are shifting, the people we're working with are shifting. And so as new people come into the mix, as new dynamics come into the mix, I think we have to be prepared and be ready and be okay with and step into with conviction these boundaries. And one of my boundaries is like not working after 5 p.m. because I find that like my mental health and my just ability to feel good in my life significantly diminishes if I work after 5 p.m. And specifically if I work past 5 on Mondays, because that always just throws me off for the rest of the week. And with this boundary of not working past 5 p.m., the tricky part about that for me is like having to work with new teams who are in different time zones, who are in Pacific time, for example, who are working, I'm in Eastern time. People I work with are in Pacific time. And so, they're working 3 hours beyond the time that I'm working. And so, this is one of those like Achilles heel boundaries that I keep getting tested on of like, are you going to work after 5? In the past, I've been really successful at like holding this boundary. And in the past few days, it's been really difficult to hold that boundary because I felt like my back is up against the wall. And, I think that's interesting even in and of itself of just like, there was this moment this week of, I talk about like our individual needs of just like resentment boiling, frustration boiling, anger, everything, all the emotions just boiling up and boiling over. That happens to each of us internally, but in the past few days I've been seeing that come at me, like it's boiling over onto me. And so it's other people trying to start to renegotiate the boundaries or start to lay the groundwork for boundaries. In my opinion, setting boundaries from a place of vulnerability is the way to do it, where you're coming from a place of just like looking after yourself, and it's not from a place of like lashing out at everyone else because of the situation that you're in. But I have seen people in the workplace start to try to set these boundaries by lashing out. And, I could tell you that that's not an effective way, because you're just making people walk on eggshells around you, and you're not actually getting anyone on your side to want to advocate for you. By you lashing out at someone for the lack of boundaries that you have, that's just not productive at all. And you're certainly not building rapport with them. You're not building trust with them. If anything, you're breaking the trust. There's cracks that are coming into the foundation of your trust. And I don't think you want that either, because at the end of the day, you need as many people advocating for you as possible, because not only do you need to have conviction in your boundaries, there's also a way to get other people to have conviction in your boundaries. By being vulnerable and bringing them along for the ride and allowing them to be a part of you setting boundaries and you excelling as a human, that's what gets people to be your lifelong advocate. Whereas like you lashing out at somebody, they aren't going to do you any favors. So that was like a really big thing that I learned this week. But still, like, those people, like, even for me, like being in that situation of somebody lashing out for their lack of boundaries, but they're lashing out at me or, people on my team. I think what's really interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before, not only is it I want other people to honor my boundaries, so I will honor their boundaries, but it's like creating a space to where you can tell people that it's okay to have boundaries with me. It's interesting because you don't know everyone's perspective on boundaries. You don't know if they feel comfortable setting them. You don't know what their childhoods were like. You don't know if they've successfully been able to set boundaries in their life. They might be boiling over and lashing out at you because that was the only way growing up that they were able to get people off their backs or get themselves out of being pinned up against the wall. Like, you never know. I mean, you start to understand like the tactics that people are using in the workplace to like set boundaries or like advocate for themselves, that stems from childhood. And so you kind of get a glimpse into their childhood through that. So you don't know where everyone's starting point is with boundaries. And so I think, in the same way, it's like when I'm trying to set boundaries for myself, it's coming at it from a place of vulnerability. I think it's also super helpful to create a space of vulnerability and create a safe space for somebody else to have boundaries with me. And because you don't always know what people feel about setting boundaries or enforcing boundaries or having boundaries, I've seen for myself this week of like, if you can proactively say to somebody, hey, it's okay to push back on my ask. Like, it's okay that you just told me that this is unreasonable, and it's okay that it's not going to meet the deadline. Now I can go level set with everyone else. Like, it's okay. The situation that I'm kind of referring to is like, I was coming to somebody with this very urgent ask. I was asking for like a less than 24-hour turnaround time. That's insane. I was asking for the world. Now, this person came back to me and they're like, this is so much work. And we have to, like, we're just now getting this request. You need this done in less than 24 hours. And my team is already working on other stuff. Like, they have full plates already. And so, basically they were just pushing back and saying, like, gently saying, like, I can't do this. Like, this is an insane ask, basically, without actually saying that. And, I'm like, I think it's always helpful in those situations to give context of like, yeah, I got this request 5 minutes before I submitted it. And we're all working on these timelines. And by the way, I appreciate you pushing back on my ask. And now I can go level set with everyone else. And that was reminding me of like, there's almost repair in setting boundaries. On the same theme of like, you never know what people think about setting boundaries in the workplace. People very well could be operating from a belief of like, bad things happen when I set boundaries, or, it's gonna, sever a relationship if I set boundaries. And what I was learning and seeing for myself this week is like, the relationships get so much stronger when you can set boundaries, and when you allow other people to set boundaries with you, and you take that and you say, I see your boundary and I will honor it. Now let me go take care of everything else so that you can maintain your boundary. It's like then me shielding this other person from everything else. And, I think really at the end of the day, if we're in an environment where everyone's backs are up against the wall, the best thing that we can do, and the thing that we must do, is look after each other. And so even if there's this overarching vibe of like, everyone's back is up against the wall and you aren't allowed to say no, this is where I was starting to see inside the clock of like, actually, there's several stages of the process, several parts and pieces of the dynamic where you can say no. And it's all about just being vulnerable. It's looking after each other. It's on a peer level, between levels. You have to double down, not only to look after yourself, but to also look out for others, because in that you develop and you build an environment where boundaries are accepted and they're honored and people feel good. Boundaries create space for wonderful things. Whatever you want to have in your life that's wonderful, like boundaries create space for those things. For me, when my boundaries aren't as strong in the workplace, it's almost like energy is just leaking out of me, like everywhere. Energy is just leaking out, and I have a really hard time like maintaining energy. It's just like I go into a state of complete exhaustion. And so for me, why boundaries are so important is so that I can maintain my energy and bring my energy to my center and be able to move forward in that. And it's being able to compartmentalize and use the energy that I need to use during the workday, but then having an ample amount of energy after I log off, after I leave work for the day, to do whatever I want to do in my personal life, work on this podcast, hang out with friends. It's like focusing on building up my personal life. And, I think without the boundaries around work, at least for me, I just feel like I'm in such a constant state of total exhaustion. I start to retreat from certain elements of my personal life. And so that's really the cost of not having boundaries. And, also my health declining, mental health, physical health, spiritual health declining. But I think when we can set boundaries, it leaves room for like incredible things to just come into our lives. And it allows us to feel good. It allows us to feel like we have control and have power over our daily lives and over how we feel. And it just sets us up for success. So I think if you've been listening to this and you've had such incredible troubles setting boundaries, or maybe you've only ever said yes in a workplace, you can absolutely say no. You can start saying no today. As soon as you start saying no, I think incredible things are going to start happening in your life because you're not taking the shit that you once took. Again, I would so advocate for you to approach it from a vulnerable perspective and just being open about where you're at, what's not working, what do you need? And, I think the initial conversation probably needs to be, more than like a 1 or 2 sentence thing. Like, I think it probably needs to be like a one-on-one sort of thing. But like after that, I've sort of gotten myself into a space, at least like, with the people I work with, where it's like, they know the background of me and they know the thing that I continuously struggle with is like teetering on the edge of burnout. And I never want to go back to the place of burnout. And they don't want that for me either. And so I think now I've gotten myself to a place where it's like, because everyone's moving so fast, I can distill my need down to one sentence. I could rattle that off when I'm talking to my manager or talking to a friend, a peer, a coworker in the workplace, and then they can start looking out for me. It's almost like the elevator pitch of your boundaries. It's like, for me, I'm like, okay, my number one thing is that I can't be across everything. My energy is everywhere. It's not really being prioritized in a way that is effective and allows me to be effective in the workplace. So eventually you'll get to a point where you can distill your need down to one sentence, and people will hear that and understand that, and there will be no questions asked. It will just be, okay, this is the thing that I need to solve. By you having like an elevator pitch of like what you need, people can start to advocate for you because they know exactly what needs to change. If you've also been watching this and being like, well, I've set boundaries and they're kind of getting walked all over right now, I think there's always an opportunity to reset the boundaries. Or maybe you set boundaries and you're like, I don't really need those boundaries anymore, but I need new boundaries. I think there's always an opportunity to renegotiate the boundaries. It really just comes down to, we all have to look after each other. And the more we can create these spaces of being able to say to somebody, it's okay to set boundaries with me. I want to be able to set boundaries with you. I want you to be able to set boundaries with me. And the more you can do that, the more you can clock that, the more you can honor that, I think the more trust you're going to build, the more advocates you're going to build for yourself, and the more you're just going to feel good in your life and feel better in your life and be able to have the energy and the mental capacity to, and emotional capacity to like bring in other things into your life that you want to have into your life. We all just need to look after each other. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye.